of course, I think like the board member and everything, people have a Sunday. We're just trying to go through and figure out, okay, what's the priority and what, is there something that you have to aware of?
Good morning. I'm Rick McLeod, Executive Director of the Savannah Riverside Community Reuse Organization, or SRS-CRO. We welcome those in attendance today and also those that are attending via webcast, live webcast. Thank you for coming today. Shortly you will hear from two groups. Four of the presenters today represent the SRS-CRO and a fifth speaker represents Aiken County. There's a description of the SRS-CRO in your press packet. I understand those on the webcast will receive a press packet via email. We are a nonprofit community organization representing 5 counties in Georgia and South Carolina. These counties surround the Department of Energy Savannah Riverside. For those of you not familiar, the Savannah Riverside is one of DOE's major defense production facilities. Located on a 310 square mile site on the South Carolina-Georgia border. It began operation in 1953 with primary responsibility for producing the basic materials for use in the nuclear weapons, primarily tritium and plutonium-239. The SRS-CRO's primary mission is to support economic development efforts and job creation, to promote new missions for the Savannah Riverside, and to serve as a unified voice for the region. We are here for the next few minutes to discuss a topic of utmost importance to our region and to the American people as a whole. That topic is the permanent disposal of high-level nuclear waste generated over the years at America's nuclear weapons plants, like our own Savannah Riverside. The Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982 established Yucca Mountain as the preferred and only site for permanent storage of nuclear waste. It also committed the federal government to accept defense waste and commercial spent fuel for long-term storage. When the waste finally reached the depths of Yucca Mountain, it would be safe and secure. It was a solution forever sealed from human intervention. In our discussions today, we will focus mostly on the high-level nuclear waste generated over more than a half-century at the nation's nuclear weapons facility. Over its 50-year history, SRS did yeoman's service in meeting the nation's need for nuclear material. In the process, high-level waste were produced and provisions were made for temporary storage of these waste materials on site. The liquid high-level waste were originally stored in more than 50 underground tanks at the Savannah Riverside. The waste was stored with the full expectation that a process would be identified that would lead to permanent disposal. In 1982, DOE published the environmental assessment for the Federal Geologic Repository, mandated by the Nuclear Waste Policy Act. In this document, borosilicate glass was chosen as a high-level waste form. In the mid-1980s, the $1.2 billion Defense Waste Processing Facility, known as DWPF, was constructed at the Savannah Riverside to carry out the process of converting the liquid waste to glass logs that then would be shipped to Yucca Mountain for permanent disposal. In 1985, the Department of Energy instituted a waste acceptance process to assure the DWPF glass waste forms would be acceptable to such a repository, in this case, Yucca Mountain. This assurance was important since production of waste forms preceded repository construction and licensing. Today, the Savannah Riverside has approximately 3,000 canisters of legacy high-level waste from the Cold War stored on site. Another 3,000 to 4,000 canisters will be generated in processing the remaining liquid radioactive waste. The finished product of all this waste has been or will be processed with specifications for the eventual disposal in Yucca Mountain. So what now? Why abandon Yucca Mountain and what will take its place? Will the waste that has already been processed meet the new acceptance criteria for another repository or disposal site? We have depended for decades on government assurances that the nuclear waste and spent fuel that now resides in our communities would be moved to a permanent repository. It was never intended that the temporary storage would remain permanent. We are here today to shine a spotlight on this issue from the standpoint of one affected community. A copy of today's agenda is in your packet. 4 speakers will talk briefly, and then we will be pleased to take your questions. Our first 3 speakers represent the SRS CRO and will discuss our primary areas of focus, including community resolutions and our request to the Department of Energy. Our last speaker, Clay Killian, represents Aiken County, South Carolina, and will discuss the county's lawsuit against the Department of Energy. I would first like to introduce the chairman of the SRS Community Reuse Organization and president of the Aiken Chamber of Commerce, David Jameson.
Good morning. We're here today as a group of communities representing a 5-county, 2-state region around the Department of Energy's Savannah Riverside. We are in Washington in force to meet with our 2-state delegation to deliver a clear message about the federal government's ill-advised decision to halt construction of the permanent nuclear waste repository at Yucca Mountain in Nevada. Many of you in this room today are community leaders from South Carolina and Georgia who have taken your time and your money to be here with us, and for that we're most appreciative. We're here to make a simple statement. The federal government has broken faith with our communities and with others across this country who trusted implicitly in the Department of Energy's commitment to complete Yucca Mountain as the nation's preferred method of nuclear waste storage. Yucca Mountain is the most studied piece of land on Earth. For 3 decades, the government has spent $10 billion in characterization of this site in the Nevada desert. And the conclusions overwhelmingly support Yucca Mountain as a viable, safe, preferred method of permanent geologic disposal. The federal government has reneged on its promise to provide a permanent repository for defense nuclear waste and for commercial spent fuel from nuclear power plants. As a region, we've counted on this promise and on the government's assurances that our site and others would be a temporary home for nuclear waste. We relied even more heavily on the promise once the choice of Yucca Mountain became the law of the land through the Nuclear Waste Policy Act. Now the federal government, through the Department of Energy, has decided to halt construction of Yucca Mountain, withdraw its licensing application, and basically go back to square one to examine potential options. We do not agree with this decision. Moreover, we find it outrageous, particularly since the federal panel formed to explore options has no community representatives at all, despite our repeated call for representation on this panel. Earlier this month, Secretary of Energy Stephen Chu said he would not linger over the decision to stop work at Yucca Mountain. He said his plans to abort Yucca Mountain will not be derailed by congressional resistance. He said his decision has been made and it's time to move forward. Mr. Secretary, we have a message for you today. With all due respect, your decision with respect to Yucca Mountain is ill-advised and wrong-headed. It ignores science, it ignores the preponderance of empirical data, it ignores the law, it ignores the will of Congress, it ignores a substantial investment of the people's resources, it ignores the federal government's decades-long promise to communities like ours, and it should not stand. Yucca Mountain is the right answer to permanent waste storage, and its completion should be pursued vigorously. Today you will hear about resolutions and lawsuits, and about our plans to continue to raise our collective voice about this ill-advised federal decision. DOE's action in terminating Yucca Mountain has the effect of turning the Savannah River site and many other locations across the country into de facto permanent waste sites. We view this as an intolerable solution and do not intend to accept it without protest. We believed we had a trusted partner in the federal government, and today that partnership is in question. In our view, the Department of Energy has broken faith with the people of the Savannah River region and with other communities who, like us, trusted the government's promise. As our Executive Director, Rick McLeod, told the DOE's Blue Ribbon Panel on America's Nuclear Future recently, we do not intend to be timid on this subject. We did our part. Our community has lived with nuclear waste for over 50 years, and we expect the government to do theirs, move the waste to a permanent repository. I would now like to introduce Sue Parr. Sue is the co-chair of the SRS-CRO Yucca Mountain Task Force and is also the president of the Augusta Metro Chamber of Commerce.
Thank you, David. Good morning. The federal government's abrupt decision to halt work on Yucca Mountain took away the most highly studied, clearly preferred option for permanent waste storage available. Yucca Mountain is not just a good choice or good policy. It is the law of the land. The Nuclear Waste Policy Act mandates that Yucca Mountain be developed as the nation's permanent nuclear waste storage facility. The government's unexpected action took communities like ours by surprise. We knew the schedule had been delayed and the pace was slow, but we thought we could count on the government to follow the law and complete Yucca Mountain as promised. In thinking about the recent events of recent months, community leaders in our region have 3 recommendations that we are submitting to federal officials for their consideration. First, we believe we deserve a seat at the table on the department's Blue Ribbon Task Force on America's Nuclear Future, which is considering options for future waste storage. There is currently no member on the panel which represents the parts of our society most affected by these deliberations. This panel has many distinguished topical and policy experts, but it does not have a voice representing the countless millions of persons on the street who live in the hundreds of communities near federal and commercial nuclear sites. What the panel recommends will impact us in the nuclear communities more than any other group. Fairness dictates that we have more than casual input. Second, any review of potential disposition options for high-level waste must include Yucca as one option. Yucca Mountain is the only known means to dispose of high-level waste, and it must not be discarded unless and until a better disposal option has been determined and verified. Many of the waste materials have been processed into an irreversible procedure into class logs, specifically to be compatible with Yucca Mountain. They may now be unsuitable for any other geological disposal option. For those of us who live near DOE sites with defense high-level waste, a geological repository at Yucca Mountain has always been the only answer. There is not now, nor has there ever been, a plan B. Like it or not, Yucca Mountain is the gold standard. Every option considered will be compared to Yucca Mountain. If Yucca Mountain is not considered in the panel's deliberations, its report will lack credibility and its impact will be minimized. Third, we support processing options as one means to reduce the quantities of spent nuclear fuel. The need for a Yucca Mountain capability varies with the processing options to be developed. However, even if spent nuclear fuel process is chosen as an option, permanent high-level waste disposal will still be required. Finally, we should say that it is important that this problem not be pushed further down the road without resolution. The Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982 envisioned a technically driven process that would be considered fair by the selected site. That process was followed in selecting Yucca Mountain. The issue of Yucca Mountain is not its safety or its technical feasibility. The issue is the lack of political will to follow the conclusions of good science. Yucca Mountain is an excellent solution to the challenges of long-term waste storage. The big problem today is not technical, it is political. What we are experiencing now is reluctance on the part of the Department of Energy to face hard political realities in a way that respects scientific evidence, promotes workable solutions, and guarantees that the government's long-standing promise to our communities and others will be honored. I would now like to introduce Brian Tucker. Brian is my co-chair on the SRS Community Reuse Organization Yucca Mountain Task Force. He also serves as president of the North Augusta Chamber of Commerce.
Good morning, folks. Thanks for coming. In recent months, the topic of nuclear waste has been pushed to the forefront of thought and action in our region and nationally, as the federal government moved to halt construction of Yucca Mountain, again with no plan B in mind. Spearheaded by the SRS Community Reuse Organization, our region has gone on record concerning our disappointment and outrage at the government's decisions to stop work on Yucca Mountain. We are announcing today that 19 political and economic development entities in our two-state region have adopted resolutions formally going on record in opposition of the government's decision to halt Yucca Mountain. These groups include the South Carolina House of Representatives, and you can see that resolution here, Aiken County, South Carolina, Allendale, South Carolina, Barnwell County, South Carolina, Augusta, Richmond County, Georgia, Columbia County, Georgia, Columbia County, Georgia Development Authority, the Greater Aiken Chamber of Commerce, the Augusta Metro Chamber of Commerce, North Augusta Chamber of Commerce, the Aiken Edgefield Development Partnership, Southern Carolina Regional Development Authority, Augusta Tomorrow, SRS Fort Gordon Alliance, SRS Community Reuse Organization, the City of Aiken, the City of Barnwell, and the Town of Fairfax. With these resolutions are largely the result of our recent efforts to raise awareness of this issue in our two-state region and nationally. While we're here, we'll present these resolutions to our congressional delegations, to the Secretary of Energy, and to the members of the Blue Ribbon Panel on Nuclear Waste. In addition to these resolutions, there have been related actions by others with respect to Yucca Mountain as well. South Carolina Governor Mark Sanford has gone on record threatening legal action at the state level to maintain Yucca Mountain as a permanent storage option, saying that 25 years of promises are being broken and South Carolinians have put $1.2 billion into this project. Following up on the governor's pledge, South Carolina's Attorney General filed a petition to intervene in the Nuclear Regulatory Commission licensing review of Yucca Mountain with the goal of ensuring that proceedings continue. He also indicated that he may take further action in the 4th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals if necessary. Other state attorney generals have joined the cause representing consumers and communities in their own states. The South Carolina State Senate has proposed legislation to require the state's utilities to put money earmarked for the repository into a state fund until the repository is operating. In recent weeks, Aiken County, South Carolina filed a lawsuit in the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia seeking judicial relief to keep the Yucca Mountain licensing process active. The state of Washington has filed a suit seeking to prevent DOE from permanently shutting down Yucca Mountain. A group of business leaders in Hanford, Washington has filed a similar suit. Last week, we were heartened by a Nuclear Regulatory Commission ruling that NRC will review its decision on whether DOE can withdraw its application to build a permanent repository at Yucca Mountain. The Commission cited these lawsuits as part of their decision, or as reason for their decision. We feel it's absolutely vital for our state and local leaders across the country to remain vigilant on this issue, as it has the potential to affect states and regions for decades to come. As our chairman, David Jameson, has noted, these resolutions represent a growing community consensus that halting work on Yucca Mountain is a bad idea, one that will force the Savannah River site to become a de facto permanent waste repository in spite of a long-standing federal promise that the waste would be moved to Yucca Mountain. I and the speakers before me represent the SRS CRO. We have discussed our primary areas of focus, including our community resolutions and our requests to the Department of Energy. Now I'd like to introduce our last speaker, Clay Killian, representing Aiken County, South Carolina. And due to their current legal action regarding the Yucca Mountain issue, he will discuss the county's lawsuit against the Department of Energy.
Thank you, Brian, and good morning to all of you. As my colleagues have indicated in their previous remarks, it is clear that Aiken County believes, as do many experts and scientists who have studied this site, Yucca Mountain is clearly the best place to store America's nuclear waste. My statement this morning will focus on Aiken County's legal actions against the United States Department of Energy for its plans to stop the application process for the Yucca Mountain project. Aiken County has filed a federal lawsuit in the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia. In our petition, we request that the court not allow the withdrawal of the application for the permit to develop Yucca Mountain as the nation's deep geologic repository for nuclear waste. We do not discuss the technical or scientific reasons that indicate Yucca Mountain is the best site for the repository, but rather focus on the law that establishes the processes for its development. The Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982, as it was amended, clearly designates Yucca Mountain as the repository for nuclear waste. Congress reiterated that intention in action taken as recently as 2002. The Act also clearly provides that the Department of Energy must prepare and submit to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission a construction license application. That application was submitted in accordance with the Act in 2008 and has been under review by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission for more than a year. It is clear to us that the Department of Energy should not short-circuit the process and that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission must be allowed to complete its work on the permit application. We also believe that the action of the Department of Energy to withdraw the application violates the National Environmental Policy Act. This act requires the preparation of a federal environmental impact statement. As part of the process of producing the environmental impact statement mandated under both the National Environmental Policy Act and the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, the Department of Energy was required to consider various alternatives to the Yucca Mountain facility and was required to solicit public comment and the comments of other federal agencies. One of those alternatives was the so-called no-build option for Yucca Mountain, an alternative rejected by the Department of Energy. In rejecting this option, the department concluded that, and I quote, "There could be large public health and environmental consequences under the no-action alternative, causing storage facilities and containers to deteriorate and radioactive contaminants from the spent nuclear fuel and high-level radioactive waste to enter the environment. In such circumstances, there would be widespread contamination at the 73 commercial and 5 DOE sites across the United States with resulting human health impacts," end quote. Therefore, by withdrawing the application, the Department of Energy has effectively attempted to implement the previously rejected no-build alternative and unlawfully foreclosed on any option involving Yucca Mountain. Aiken County further believes the action of the Department of Energy is in violation of the United States Constitution in that legislative action is vested in the Congress and executive powers vested with the President. The executive branch acting through its Department of Energy cannot ignore or violate a properly adopted law of the United States Congress. The Nuclear Waste Policy Act is clear in its meaning and must be implemented as adopted. The current administration has stated its intention not to proceed with the Yucca Mountain project. Many affected persons have attempted to engage in meaningful discussions about the matter, and while our congressional delegation has been very supportive and active, our requests have not met with much success. The citizens of our region have been rebuffed at every turn by the Department of Energy when attempting to understand the rationale behind and the impact of their Yucca Mountain decision on our community. Given the fact that nobody in the department appears to be listening to our pleas, or worse, is simply dismissing them as unimportant, Aiken County felt it was both necessary and proper to take legal action at this time in order to require that the licensing procedure go forward. It is abundantly clear to us that the Department of Energy's actions are in violation of the Nuclear Waste Policy Act and raise serious separation of powers concerns. These laws are lawfully enacted by Congress and should not be ignored by the department. Rather, we call on the department to aggressively implement the requirements of these laws in the most expeditious manner. Thank you very much, and I will now turn the program back to Mr. McLeod.
Now we will take questions, and let's don't forget that we do have a live webcast as well, so we'll be taking questions from the back of the room. We will limit the questions to media only. We ask the reporter to identify him or herself and the name of their organization. We need you to always use a microphone to make sure everyone can hear, especially those on the webcast. With that, we'll open it up for any questions.
Thank you. Matt Wald at the New York Times. Two questions. Yucca was overbooked. Would all your stuff have fit there? And the other is the Blue Ribbon Commission obviously wants to consider recycling or reprocessing. SRS now has the only reprocessing facilities operating in the United States. Would you be a candidate site for that kind of reprocessing, or would you rule that out because there's no place for that waste to go either?
The first part of your question, originally, if you remember, Yucca Mountain was designated for 70,000 metric tons of waste. 10,000 of that was coming from the defense nuclear waste portion. The other was spent nuclear fuel. And that's one thing here today we want folks to realize there's two different issues. We're basically have a material that cannot be reprocessed or recycled. It's already
been, right?
It's already vitrified into glass, so we cannot reverse that process. That waste has to go somewhere. We also, reprocessing would have to be decided on a national front, but we do feel like Savannah Riverside would play a role either in the research and development. Of course, any reprocessing would be multiple years down the road.
Is there space for your material at Yucca if Yucca were to open?
We need to get the microphones.
I'm sorry, my question was, is there space for your material at Yucca if Yucca were to open? There's already more than 70,000 metric tons of material to dispose of.
But in the beginning, it was always designated that part of that percentage would be defense waste material, just like a portion would be for spent nuclear fuel. So we have envisioned that rationale or that proportion would still stand if we move forward. So it still would have the room depending upon how much spent fuel went in there, and also depending upon whether reprocessing is chosen. It all doesn't have to go in one day, keep that in mind. So it would be a process over a period of time. Any other questions?
Hi, Suzanne McGallion with Platts. I was just wondering, I talked about this earlier, but what other communities in the U.S. are you looking to hook up with, or are you who are in the same boat to expand your base?
Of course, Idaho, Hanford community, actually New York and West Valley, and ourselves are in a similar situation. Hanford is beginning to build a facility similar to what I referred to as defense waste processing facility. They're also kind of in a quandary of what waste mixture they have to meet now with a repository not on the table, and how will they go about building the facility and what will be their waste mixture moving forward. So Hanford is probably the more closer to our situation, although we've already generated the waste and are storing it on site.
Yeah, Steve Tatro, Las Vegas Review-Journal. I think, as you've mentioned, the Department of Energy has been fairly resolute about wanting to move forward with this, and as you know, the Senate Majority Leader has been resolute as well as far as wanting to terminate that program. I'm wondering, at this point, does it look like the lawsuits are your best or only option? And maybe you could talk a little bit about what hopes you have as far as convincing people during your trip this week.
I don't know if we would consider it the only option. It's obviously one that Aiken County felt was important to take, a step to take to try to at least not get the licensing process short-circuited. I think there's another process. The reason that all these communities adopted the resolutions that they did, we're coming obviously to see our congressional delegations, both from the Georgia and South Carolina sides today, to help them understand our desire. I think they do understand that, but it's again, that side of the aisle is working as well, but the lawsuit we felt was important, as did several other jurisdictions around the country.
Hi, I'm Bob Keefe with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. You mentioned in discussing the lawsuit some of the potential dangers to your community, but talk about the current concerns economically and otherwise in your communities, and tell me frankly how much space do you have left? How much can you continue to store temporarily?
We currently have a glass waste storage building, as is referred to, full. We're about, I would say about halfway, maybe a little more on the second one. We're accelerating the waste cleanup from the tanks, which we want to proceed. So we will have a third glass waste storage building being needed probably in the next 2 to 3 years. So we have that material already on site. The concern, these facilities are built probably with a 40 to 50 year design life. The concern in the community is not that these facilities are not safe. The concern is that they have not been evaluated or studied for long-term permanent disposal. So that's the concern we have. And of course, leaving the waste on site could have a negative impact on economic development and jobs from folks that may not be familiar or comfortable, as our community is, with the nuclear industry.
What you just said about people.
Please, your name and who you're
I'm
with.
sorry, Joe Trento with DCBureau.org. I'm curious, you said that people may not be comfortable who are not familiar with Savannah River as a site, who may be new to the community.
Well, industries coming in that may not be as new or familiar with nuclear industries. The Savannah Riverside safety record is pretty unprecedented. It's an extremely safe site, but not everyone knows that. And also, companies coming in, if they just hear the word nuclear, may be opposed to the whole being sited near a nuclear facility.
Right. Hasn't Savannah River had a long history of problems in reprocessing, in controlling waste?
Well, when you say reprocessing, we're not reprocessing spent nuclear fuel or any of the, and we're really not here to talk about that subject. We're here today to talk about the resolutions that we have going forward. So that's another subject. I'll be glad to talk with you after the meeting to touch base about that.
Let me ask you about this lawsuit. If you lose the lawsuit, if you're not successful, what is your plan B?
We're going to have to evaluate that when that happens.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Cindy, any from the back?
Okay, this question is asked by Tom Clements from Friends of the Earth.
We're going to take it only from media, Cindy.
Okay.
Only from media.
Then there are no questions at this point.
We have one back up front, Cindy, then.
Thank you, Matt Wald, Times. One more. Hanford has pulled in its borders, cut the size of the reservation, concentrated the waste in one portion of the reservation. Would that be a good strategy for Savannah River? You have some materials that were never going to go to Yucca Mountain. You've got low-level waste buried there, etc. Is it time to think about long-term and consolidating what you've got so the rest of the site's available for reuse?
Well, that's actually kind of a different subject, but all the sites are doing a footprint reduction. And that is happening at Savannah Riverside too. But it's not moving the waste into one consolidated area. It's actually moving the industrial sites. The old sites are being closed or D&D'd, and then we're moving more of the activities are going to be in one area, leaving the other sites available, the other portions of the site available for future use. Anything, Cindy, from the...
Maybe one more to say.
Only from the media. If you're media,
The nuclear monitor.
okay. And your name, and wait for the mic.
I am just a little confused because you have acknowledged an interest in being part of the reprocessing infrastructure in the future, which would essentially bring the nation's high-level nuclear waste to South Carolina. And yet you're talking about the desire for it to leave, the calculations would indicate that there's more glass logs at Savannah River Site now than would fit in the present 70,000 metric tons at Yucca Mountain. So,
Well, now, if the whole 70,000 metric tons is available, that's not true. If the spent fuel does not go to Yucca Mountain, there, under the current design, there is plenty of space to store all of the defense waste within the DOE complex.
so it's a
at
what
Yucca
if,
Mountain.
it's a what if Plan C that we don't have today that you're talking about. But essentially, wouldn't it be more honest if you started advocating for a second repository?
Well, since we don't have a first one yet, it's hard to advocate for a second one. So until we get this one going, I don't think we can advocate for a second one. But this would be an actual ideal location to store the defense waste that we're talking about that is solidified into glass that cannot be reprocessed or recycled. It has nowhere to go. As far as the reprocessing, again, it's a reprocessing facility will not be built in the next 3 to 5 years. We're talking about a long-term commitment by the U.S. to do that. What we're saying is Savannah Riverside has a lot of human capital, a lot of technologies that could help with the research related to whether or not that's a viable option or not. And also, if we do that, I think our community would be against an interim storage or consolidation of spent nuclear fuel at Savannah Riverside unless a reprocessing facility was built either before or during that process.
But the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, as written today, would not actually solve South Carolina's problem. Is that correct?
I don't think that's correct. And whereas the Nuclear Waste Policy Act says Yucca Mountain needs to open.
But there's not enough room for your glass logs.
Yeah, but it was always a,
She's right. I'm deeply confused, and that was my question. Sorry to interrupt. If we don't reprocess, I'm sorry.
Yeah, do you want to-
I'm confused. We should straighten this out. Under the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, we have a once-through system. We have no reprocessing. Are you agreeing that if we don't reprocess, your waste won't all fit there? We must reprocess the civilian waste for there to be space for all of your waste at the defense waste at Yucca Mountain?
not if our waste has first priority. And also,
But the
What
current
there-
law does not provide for that.
there is no priority under the current law. It just
Yes,
says
there's a
70,000.
queue. There's a queue.
But,
And it's by contract and it's by law, and that's why the federal government is paying damages.
but if the
And
spent
we all
fuel
agree that's
cannot
pretty
go in
stupid.
there, then that would leave room for our defense waste.
A new law.
Right.
The current law does not provide.
Or an amendment to the law.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Nothing?
Hi, I'm Paul Connor from the Daily Caller. I'm wondering if you've met with Secretary Chu and what his reactions have been to your group.
We have not met with the secretary, no.
Do you expect to in the near future?
Probably not with the secretary, but we do have some meetings later while we're on our visit to meet with the Department of Energy headquarters level.
What do you get the sense that their reaction is to your pushback?
We haven't had a sense. We haven't heard back from them. So really no response from them on our actions.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you a question about the possibility of a deal. If you could make a deal with the federal government about taking the vitrified waste, would that satisfy your desires?
That would meet our intent to get the waste off-site that was always promised by the government.
Would you still be in favor of the facility continuing taking waste in and processing it from other countries, from other places?
Well, again, you're talking about two different issues there, so I'll get with you afterwards. It's the
Well,
reprocessing is
I
a totally
understand,
different issue
But you're
of the current
basically saying
reprocessing.
we want to get rid of this old waste, but we want to keep the jobs in South Carolina, so we're willing to take new waste in. It is a bit of a conundrum for the public trying to understand the
Well,
issue.
Well, what we're trying to say is that the spent fuel out there, it still has to be handled some way, whether it goes to the repository, and in, I guess now, a year and a half, we'll hear what the Blue Ribbon Commission's recommendation is on that subject. One of those will probably have to be considered would be reprocessing. And it's going to be interesting to see what recommendation they come out with reprocessing. Whether they want to consolidate the waste at one location and reprocess it, whether they want to just say, we're going to put it in Yucca Mountain and do retrievable storage. There's a lot of options on the table, and this is a moving target that we're dealing with. So we do not have all of the answers right now. But what we're saying is, as far as the reprocessing, We do have some research and development capability at Savannah Riverside that could help determine whether that's a path to move forward.
I have one question coming in. This is asked by George Lobsons from the Energy Daily. Do you believe the Yucca Mountain decision is totally political and solely due to Senator Reid's opposition and his influence with the Obama administration?
We do believe it's political, but we are not going to get into a finger-pointing situation.
I'm also the nuclear monitor. The West Valley nuclear waste site did the only commercial reprocessing in the country, and the price tag for cleaning up that site is now in the range of $10 billion. How can Savannah River consider new reprocessing when we're being told by the Department of Energy that West Valley, they can't even decide whether to clean it up in 10 years, for 10 more years?
I guess I'll repeat it. We're not saying that we're intending to do reprocessing. We're supportive of the reprocessing idea as a way to diminish the quantity of spent nuclear fuel that would have to go to a repository. What we're saying is it needs to be an option on the table and be considered. And hopefully the Blue Ribbon Commission will use that as an option. What we're saying is Savannah Riverside, again, has some human capital, some experience that could help determine whether that is a viable option now or not.
So you have at the site already the weapons reprocessing waste and whatever other foreign waste came in. But at West Valley, where they did do commercial reprocessing, it's that waste is, we're being told that waste is not, there's nowhere to put it, there's nothing, that it can't be cleaned up, that it's very expensive to clean up, and the Department of Energy has to wait. They were saying 30, now they're saying at least 10 years before they can decide what to do with it. Doesn't this instruct in some way whether communities would want to have more reprocessing?
Well, again, that's not our focus here today. It's not trying to discuss and decide the reprocessing issue. Our discussion here today is to focus on Yucca Mountain and the law of the land, which says Yucca Mountain should open. So we'd glad to talk later, but
If
that's
it's
not...
licensed, yeah.
We'll probably take time for maybe 2 more questions and then we'll cut things off.
What is the delegation's agenda for the rest of the day? Who will you be seeing on the Hill?
We'll be meeting with the 2 senators from Georgia and the 2 senators from South Carolina this afternoon. And in the morning, we meet with most of the congressmen from the impacted area of South Carolina and Georgia. Now,
The whole group?
we all go as a group. We talk. We will be meeting at DOE tomorrow afternoon, but we figure the Yucca Mountain subject will have been covered when we get there, and we have some other things that we need to talk to them about other than Yucca Mountain tomorrow. We'll be back.
One more question, or if not, we appreciate you turning out, appreciate the attendance, and we'll adjourn the meeting this time. We're available by email, the card's in your packet, and if you have other further questions, we'll be glad to cover them at that time. Thank you.